As Ed mentioned, the research group that I lead at Yale, we're called Data-Driven Yale, and we seek to apply data science and quantitative evidence-based approaches to environmental policy issues. And so I want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing, particularly looking at the role of data and information with respect to China's environmental decision-making and management, and the role that new sources of data, data innovation, big data can play in the future, and some of the work that we've done to answer the question of what is the rise and emergence of data, big data, and so happy to see Simon talk about Bitcoin because that's also an emergent technology. But first, I want to start with a story. And in 2012, a friend who was studying in Urumqi in Xinjiang province in western China sent me this photo. And on this particular day, she wanted to know what the air quality was in Urumqi. And so she took out her iPad and accessed this app that had official Chinese data on air quality. And so you can see on this app that it says that air quality in Urumqi is good, or the score of 1. So on a scale of 0 to 500, with 500 being the worst or hazardous air quality, on this particular day, the data and the statistics are showing that the air quality is good. But then she looked outside. So she's actually holding this iPad outside. And you can see those are buildings in the background. But it's totally obscured by the fact that there's extremely severe air pollution in this image. And so it's images like these, and as Ed mentioned, citizens were going to the internet and looking at the US Embassy's own independent monitoring data and noticing that there were differences between what the Chinese government statistics showed. So on days when Chinese official data were saying that air was only slightly or lightly polluted, the US Embassy data said that actually the data and the air quality was hazardous or even dangerous. And one of the main reasons for this discrepancy is the fact that the US Embassy was monitoring fine particulate pollution, or PM 2.5. Who in this room has heard of PM 2.5? Great, so probably roughly a third or half of folks. Well, at this time, that was the center of this controversy and the difference between these air pollution statistics. And so netizens were starting to take note of the fact that the Chinese official data lacked measurement for PM 2.5, which is the most health-relevant pollutant because it's invisible to the human eye. It's a class of toxic chemicals that can penetrate human lung and blood tissue and lead to cardiovascular disease, asthma, and other respiratory conditions. And so you can see that these are mentions that I've compiled from Sina Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, mentions of PM 2.5 dating back from 2010 all the way up to 2014. And there's a noticeable spike in January 2012 when air pollution levels reached 755 micrograms per cubic meter. To give you a sense of how severe that is, that's 75 times higher than what the World Health Organization recommends as a safe limit. And so this discourse dramatically led to an increased awareness on PM 2.5 and air pollution issues throughout China. And some of these changes I was observing while I was a PhD student studying in Beijing. And what I noticed is that people, this is from a poster from a music festival in Guiyang, and here they've taken PM 2.5 and adopted as a moniker of this music festival. And then in department stores, I was noticing for the first time air filters and purifying machines were showing up on the shelves, and they were all advertising cleaning PM 2.5. In 2013, I took my students to a golf course outside of Shenzhen called Happy Valley, and they were advertising on these banners, PM 2.5, retreat from the city's air pollution and breathe air free of PM 2.5 by coming to our 5-star golf course. And so this just shows some of the awareness and the environmental awakening that was happening centered around data and information. Shortly thereafter, because of these calls, the Chinese government began to release real-time information on PM 2.5 for the first time. And so now you can access this Chinese government portal, this is a China National Environmental Monitoring Center, and access real-time 24-hour data for around 300 cities throughout China. And so I wanted to start with this example because I think it's a great illustration of the role that data, in particular data accuracy and transparency, can play in helping to drive improvements in environmental policy. Because of this data, citizens can access this portal and they can understand what the health impacts are of certain air pollution concentrations. And also, this data has been used to help benchmark local leader performance, which we'll talk about in a second. And so, but arguably, we can say that this data-based approaches or the emphasis on information dates back, way back to the economic reform and opening in the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping reinterpreted this ancient Chinese proverb dating back from the Han Dynasty, 实事求是, or seeking truth from facts, meaning that we shouldn't be relying on our gut or ideologies or dogmas in order to guide policy. Actually, we should be searching for evidence and seeking truth from facts to guide economic reform and policy decisions. And then if we move forward several years to more modern China leadership, there has been an emphasis placed on the fact that Chinese growth and development needs to be based on a scientific outlook on development, which puts people first and encourages or ushers in a harmonious society, this 和谐社会. And also, most recently, Xi Jinping has implemented or ushered in this idea that we need to emphasize ecological civilization or 生态文明. And so arguably, there's been this emphasis on data and information. So why is it that it's taken so long in that example that I just showed you for the recognition and that information transparency and data accuracy actually matters for environmental management and for policy? And I think a lot of that points back to the fact that China is considered by a lot of metrics to be an information-poor environment where there are restrictions to the free flow of information. And so this is where a lot of my research comes in, is what does it mean to apply a data-driven approach or evidence-based policymaking in a context where you don't have the free flow of information? And so there's a scholar, Arthur Mull, who has identified certain characteristics for why certain societies may be considered information poor. It can be due to economic constraints. So perhaps there is not the capacity or the financial resources to collect high-quality data. There can also be political limitations. In the Chinese context, the restriction of the free flow of information. And there could also be institutional or organizational challenges that I'll talk about in a second with respect to one of our projects. And since 2008, however, China has had these open government information regulations largely modeled after those types of regulations in the West. But if you notice, I've highlighted Article 8, which says that the government information disclosed by administrative organs may not endanger state security, public security, economic security, and social stability. And the way that's been translated with respect to environmental data is that government officials are restricted in terms of what data they can collect, because many of the environmental indicators and data are considered state secrets. So for a long time, soil pollution, actually going back to our previous panel, was considered a state secret because of the threat of soil contamination to human and public health. And so in 2008, one of the projects that I worked on directly with the Chinese government was trying to implement a data-based approach to environmental policy management, and in particular, policy implementation at the provincial level in China. And this was in response to the fact that for many years, the Chinese government had been trying to quantify economic losses associated with its rapid environmental growth. And so if you've heard of this Green GDP project, it massively failed in 2004 due to issues of data quality and also some resistance from local leaders. And so we were approached by the Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Chinese Academy for Environmental Planning, which is a think tank of the MEP, and they wanted us to ask this question: is it possible, given available environmental data in China at the local level, for us to develop a set of indicators, a framework that they could use to track how different provincial leaders were performing on environmental issues and achieving environmental goals? And so this was the project that we set out to do, and to try to understand whether or not a data-driven approach was possible for the Chinese policy context. And this is based off of a project that I led at Yale for 7 years called the Environmental Performance Index, which ranks 180 countries around the world on key issues like air, water, forest, climate change, et cetera. And so we really wanted to adapt this EPI, or this Environmental Performance Index framework, for the Chinese context. And they were interested in adopting an international framework to lend transparency and credibility to Chinese policy performance. And so here is a look at the framework that we developed in collaboration with our partners. And it seems like there's a lot here and many indicators, but actually this represents a political negotiation between what science says a country should be monitoring and evaluating for sound environmental policy and what data China actually had available. And so we wanted to actually evaluate all of these other issues that I've shown here on the right, including soil quality, water contamination, for example. But then for reasons of either lack of available data or political restrictions, so for example, in the environmental health category, at the time we were doing this analysis, I was told by our Chinese partners that there's no way you're going to get data on environmental-related mortality because that data is incredibly sensitive. And so we were not given access to many of the indicators that we include in our global framework because of issues of political sensitivity, lack of available data, and a variety of other reasons. And so when the official report was released to the MEP, you can see this official Chinese government white paper here about our project. It said that actually the whole project was a failure. So I know the title of this conference is Finding Solutions, but I thought I would help find a solution by talking about our failure. And so I'll go into the reasons now why this project failed, but this, at the time when we finished this project in 2011, we couldn't actually produce that set of indicators, that consistent, transparent framework that the Chinese so desperately wanted in order to lend credibility to their efforts. And I'll go through some of the reasons why this project failed. First of all, baseline data availability was at that time incredibly sparse for us to actually evaluate many of the categories that we were seeking to measure. So for example, we found the most amount of data, oh, there is a laser pointer, most amount of data here for the economic sustainability category. So these are things like resource use efficiency, energy intensity, for example. I hear my baby in the background, apologies for that. And so this reflects I think the framework and the policy priority of the Chinese government to think more specifically about how to evaluate efficiency within its own government operations. But yet other critical areas, for example, ecosystem vitality, how provinces were managing natural resources and surface water quality, for example, we couldn't find very much data to evaluate those issues, even though they're critically important, particularly for human health. And then we didn't have any access to raw data. So we were provided with official government statistics, for example, on marine quality that said a percentage of these marine areas were either above standard, below standard, or certain classes, but we weren't given access to the raw pollution data that was desperately needed in order to develop credible and accurate measures. And so that was also a huge issue, just the lack of transparency with respect to where these data came from, how they were being collected and monitored, and how the quality was also being assured. So that presented another challenge. And then last, there were conflicting data points for the same indicators from different sources. So here's a plot, it's a little bit hard to see, but on the x-axis are different provinces and municipalities in China, and in the dots here are different sources of air quality data for sulfur dioxide emissions. And you can see in some cases the data align quite nicely. So Beijing, Chongqing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, for example, have pretty close alignment with respect to local level sources of data and national level sources of data. But then in some cases you have huge divergence between the different sources. And so you look at this data and you have to ask, well, what's accurate? And how do I evaluate that? How can I tell which is actually the correct source of data and what data point I should actually use? And so this presented another challenge for us to develop this indicator system. And so I took a step back, and the following summer after this project massively failed, I returned to China and spent some time meeting with government officials all throughout China to really understand how data was being monitored for air and water throughout the country, and what were some of the major stumbling blocks for why we couldn't get consistent, accurate data, and what were some of the root causes of these quality issues. And one of the findings one of the conclusions was, first of all, there's a lack of institutional coordination with respect to how environmental data was being monitored and collected. So here's a map that I developed of how information is collected for the environment from the very local levels here and translated all up to the national level here. And so you can see it goes through many channels. And there are lots of different data sources. And I think the next speaker will talk about some of the official data that's being collected from these very lowest levels of corporations and also through environmental quality. But you can see it's an incredibly complicated process. And in some cases, you have institutional redundancy where you may have 3 different institutions that are all charged with collecting waste data, but yet there's no data sharing that's allowed between those organizations. And so you get this redundancy, and it produces what I just showed in terms of the air quality data with differences in the numbers and not a real way to reconcile because of the lack of sharing and openness. So this was one of the major challenges. Secondly, what I found is that there are actually weak incentives for environmental protection and environmental performance evaluation. But this is starting to change. So with the introduction of the 12th five-year plan, which was considered the greenest five-year plan yet, China for the first time made economic growth indicators aspirational or non-binding, and made the environmental indicators that I've listed here binding for the first time. And so that was a notable change to try to shift the balance away from an emphasis at the local level on environmental or economic results and economic growth to actually achieving these environmental targets. But what I found is when I interview government officials about what does this actually mean, what happens, what are the consequences and the punishment mechanisms if you don't actually achieve these targets, there was huge variation in what attitudes local government officials had towards what this actually meant in practice. And so consistently, the 40-some government officials that I spoke with said, oh no, no one loses their job if they don't meet these targets. If anything, you're just going to get a reprimand. And only in the case of really severe environmental accidents, like for example, the algal bloom that afflicted Lake Tai in 2007, do people actually lose their jobs. So I think enforcement is still a major issue when it comes to environmental policy in China. And then last, what I found is that there's actually quite limited autonomy for environmental governance amongst Chinese government officials. So part of the reason why we found so many gaps with respect to our China Indicators project is because government officials don't feel like they actually have the authority to collect additional data that they don't have a government mandate to collect. And so this was the case in a government official I met with in Suzhou, Liu Wenbao, who was actually one of the government officials responsible, or was responsible for monitoring at the time the Lake Tai incident happened. And he's showing me on a map here Lake Tai, and what he mentioned is that one of the reasons why that algal bloom happened is because they weren't monitoring. They didn't have a mandate to monitor quality of the water in that lake. And so it wasn't until the algal bloom happened where they were very reactionary in terms of responding to that situation. And it was largely because they weren't able, they didn't feel like they had the autonomy to regularly monitor and collect additional data in order to prevent that situation from happening. And actually, there is one more point, variable public demand for information. One of the other points that government officials pointed to in the study, when I asked them, well, why is it that we haven't released PM 2.5 data? If it's so relevant for human health, why is it that we don't have that information publicly available? And some of the responses I received were, well, even if we did release that data, citizens wouldn't understand what it means. I mean, PM 2.5, it's technical, it's an abbreviation, it's scientific, and so they may not actually understand. So what's the point of releasing that information anyways? But I think the example that I started with shows, well, actually that is quite critical. So I know I'm running out of time, so I want to move forward to now. China has been placing a lot of emphasis on the role that big data can play, and I think they recognize, particularly through this air pollution incident and these contestations over data and information and the need for accuracy and transparency, that data can actually be a friend and not a foe when it comes to environmental management, that they need to be harnessing the power of data in order to more effectively manage environmental situations. And so here you have Chen Jining, who is the Minister of Environmental Protection in China, announcing 2 years ago that China is going to build an ecological big data platform in order to take advantage of new advances in technology and innovation in data. So what does this actually look like? Well, the MEP has been partnering with IBM, for example. This is a great solution and an example of a public-private partnership that's actually making a difference in Beijing. And so using weather data, IBM has been developing these forecasting models to help develop these maps for the Ministry of Environmental Protection to forecast where there might be pollution hotspots in the immediate future, so 24 to 48 hours. So this is an example of how they're incorporating big sources of data to be more sensitive and able to anticipate certain hotspots of air pollution. And then we've also written these series of white papers, and I've included this link here, to understand what exactly the potential is for future sources of big data. Also, citizen science is an emerging field of data that is becoming, I think, a really hot topic in not only the Chinese context, but all throughout the world. So what is the potential for us to actually have more people, whether it's citizens, whether it's scientists, tech providers, companies, to incorporate and provide data into the Chinese policymaking process? And so that was what this series of white papers focused on. And so one of the examples, and I'm hoping that Xuxing will talk about this, is now the Chinese government has been trying to utilize citizen-generated data and transparency to better manage urban water pollution through an app that they've built through the WeChat messaging platform, and it's called the Black and Smelly Waters app. So it's kind of a funny name, but it is proving to be so far pretty successful. And so what users can do with this app, when they come across a polluted body of water in China, they can geolocate it with their smartphone. And then what happens is they file a report to describe how smelly and how polluted that source of water is. And then it files a message to the local government official that's responsible for that body of water, and they have 7 days to respond how they expect to remedy that particular source of pollution. And so this is a really inventive way that China's government is trying to utilize citizens to help with environmental enforcement and to encourage local government officials to be more responsive and to actually implement environmental policies. And so here's some initial data that we put together to examine this data and where the data is being collected. So this is a forthcoming paper, but you can see already hotspots in more developed cities like Beijing, for example, and some parts of southeastern China seem to be hotspots of reporting for the Black and Smelly Waters app. But this is a great example, I think, of how data innovation is helping in China's environmental pollution fight. Okay, well, thank you so much, and here's my contact information, and looking forward to your questions.